This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everyone. We will get started in a bit. We're just going to wait for. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's ITE-ANZ webinar. The topic for today is designing for cyclist safety. We're really pleased that you guys can join us today. My name is Ilsa Malagamba, and I will be moderating today's session. And again, I would just like to let you know that we are recording the session and it will be available for everybody to view in a few days on the ITE-ANZ website. We would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first inhabitants of the nation and the traditional custodians of the lands where we live, learn, and work. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We acknowledge and respect the Treaty of Waitangi and Maori as the original people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. We acknowledge any people of Indigenous descent who are joining us here today. And if anybody is new to our webinars, just a little bit about ITE. So we are part of a global organization that focuses on research, learning, and networking for people with a passion and interest in transportation. And we're always accepting new members. So we really highly encourage you guys to sign up so that you don't miss out on any of our future webinars or the many activities and events that we plan. So yep, if you want to sign up, there's all of our socials and our email if you have any questions. I would also like to take a moment to say thank you to our great sponsors who allow us to provide great events, awards, and opportunities for our members. So thank you for all of our sponsors. Just a little bit of housekeeping. The Q&A session will be at the end once our two presenters have finished. If you have any questions directly towards one of the presenters, please just type their name in so that I can make sure and ask that to them. And again, this recording will be available on the ITE-ANZ website. So we have two really great presenters today, Max McArdle and Nicole Badstruber. So we will start with Max today. And I will just read out a little bit about Max and then hand it over to him. So I can stop sharing, Max, and then you can start setting up your slides while I introduce you. So Max McArdle is a senior project engineer working for Safe Systems Solutions, a consultancy specializing in road safety. Max is regularly involved in reviewing and developing innovative cycling and pedestrian-focused projects across Australia. Prior to this role, Max gained international experience working in the UK as a site engineer and managing the construction of shared paths and various other bicycle facilities. Max is a keen commuter and recreational cyclist with both a professional and personal interest in exploring best practice designs and delivering cycling infrastructure. Max has taken his passion for all things cycling and led the development of the cycling infrastructure training course offered by Safe Systems Solutions, aiming to sharpen road safety practitioners' skills in identifying and providing solutions for cyclist safety. So without further ado, off to you, Max.
Thank you, Ilsa, for that lovely bio. Has the presentation shared at your ends?
Yes, it is.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you very much. Max McArdle, Project Development Lead here at Safe Systems Solutions. And it's going to be quite a condensed version of this presentation, but there's one kind of case study that I wanted to share with everyone today. So thanks for joining in during lunchtime, but it's actually a town in the Netherlands called Houten or Houten. So we will be jet setting across the world, heading over to Europe, this tiny little country that's regularly recognized as one of the best cycling cities and areas in the world. And the actual area that we'll be looking at is just south of Utrecht there. It's a little town called Houten, which was kind of developed in the 80s, so relatively new, but the planning and the thinking about it started in the 60s. So we'll get into exactly why I'm talking about this in a moment, but in order to set the scene, we'll just have a look at generally how our road networks are managed across jurisdictions, where we take, major kind of freeways and highways, and they're kind of seen as, the main predominant mover of traffic, generally focused on heavy vehicles and motor vehicles, serve longer distances and things like that. And where there are access points to other roads, they're generally managed with interchanges, so there's a continuous flow on the motorways. We also have our arterials, which also serve a very significant traffic function, but not quite as significant as the motorways. Then we hop into our little collectors, which are more of a neighborhood type of feel. So that's just another step down, and they provide more connection to local residences as well as inter-neighborhood travel. And the final is our local streets. So we have this general hierarchy, which you can see, copied and pasted across basically every capital city and township that you visit. So this kind of philosophy has been applied across the board, but the town of Houghton has kind of flipped this, because generally this classification is focused on motor vehicles. They're the primary consideration. Houghton went with a different approach. So we'll chat about that soon. We've also moved into this space of movement and place. For those that haven't heard this concept, I'm not going to go into great detail because it is quite a lot of information in here, but the principle is that roads and all our network, they have two key functions. One of them is movement, so the movement of people, the movement of goods. That's obviously a key function of our road network, but the road network also has this place function. In other words, it's somewhere, it's an area where people actually want to congregate, they want to spend time, they want to enjoy their time while they're being there. So it's kind of setting up these two different functions for the road reserves. This is actually taken out of the Transport for New South Wales movement and place document, but there's other jurisdictions who have produced similar reports. And it's this idea that Houghton has really excelled at, where we're considering at a first point of view are our vulnerable road users, which is referred to as pedestrians, people in wheelchairs, mobility scooters, cyclists, also motorcyclists. But if we put them at the forefront, how would our road network actually look? Second to that, or the next tier down, would be public transport, then heavy vehicles, that's connected or autonomous vehicles, and right at the end, personal vehicle use. So kind of flipping this idea that we need to cater for personal passenger vehicles first, and then everything else can follow. I'll show you an aerial view of how things were looking. This was taken in the 80s. So this is the northeast quadrant of Houghton. There is currently being constructed. This area around here is kind of like a main square or a main retail precinct. You might have noticed this along here is a railway line. So this is things that are being constructed at the moment. And I'll show you how things look in current day. So this was just taken from Google Maps. But you can see from an aerial view, there's nothing significantly different as to why the way that this precinct has been developed. You can see lots of main roads, collector roads, local streets. All of that general principle is still being applied here, but the way that it's actually managed is taken a little bit differently. So the population of this town is about 50,000 people, so it's a relatively large city. When they started planning for this in the 60s, the principle wasn't actually to be bike friendly, but to be a livable community where children could play in the street. So that was one of their founding principles. It's located about 5 miles outside of Utrecht, which is a larger city. But this is generally quite what we would consider almost like a suburb. It's single medium density housing. Car ownership is about 415 cars per 1,000 residents. And on average, there's 1.1 parking spaces per resident. So it's not like this is no cars are allowed within this space and it's a car-free zone. That's That's not the way they've treated this city, but there's other little things going on that really emphasize vulnerable road user modes instead of just general traffic. So we'll hop into an example. Here's a map of the entire Houghton area. So the section we were looking at before was just that top right hand. But the first thing you may have noticed is on the periphery of Houghton, there is this ring road. So this is just an area that is exclusively, Houghton has decided this is where cars will have the, the lion's share. That's where we will prioritize their movements. And just to give you an example of what that looks like, it looks like something like this. It's a 70 kilometer per hour ring road. And you might have also noticed that there is a off-road shared path there. So there is still cycle opportunities adjacent that corridor, but for the on-road facility, it's certainly the focus is the movement of general traffic. So that's our ring road. And this is where things get a little bit more interesting. I'm just going to focus on the northern section just because it's quite a big town. And I'm going to pop in some extra lines for you to consider. So what I've noted here as permeable barriers, it's permeable in the sense that cyclists can pass through these and pedestrians can pass through these barriers. However, motorists cannot. So the first one that I highlighted there, this is the railway line that I mentioned before. There's only 2 opportunities where motorists can travel past that railway line. There's nowhere else they can cross it. Similarly, there's parks and there's rivers and things like that, which provide physical separation between different localities within Houghton. So cyclists are able to travel through them quite easily. It's quite permeable, but it's not the case for vehicles. And what that actually means in practice, if you were to take a point A and point B, as I've just edited here, if you were a motorist, you can't actually travel, the shortest distance possible as the crow flies. You have to kind of head around the ring road and then head to B. Whereas if you're walking or cycling, you can head straight there. So that's the idea of these permeable barriers. You've basically created within this township distinct little districts, and you can travel within your district within your motor vehicle. But if you want to get to another district, you have to go onto the ring road, and then you have to, take an interchange off there. And what it actually has created is it means it's less attractive to actually get in your car because it's likely going to take you longer because you're going to have to, find a park. You're going to have to get on the ring road. Could be congestion there and all those types of things. So you're just much more inclined, if it's more convenient for you to actually walk or to cycle than to get behind the wheel. And just to show that as an actual example, I just did this quick example in Google Maps, but just pick 2 random points and let's have a look. If you drove between those 2 districts within Houghton, it would take you about 10 minutes and it's about a 6-kilometer drive. If you cycled between those 2, take you 2 minutes, it's about 850 meters. And if you were to walk in between them, it's about 8 minutes as well, and slightly less time because you can walk through this shopping mall district. So interestingly, it's actually quicker to walk in this example than to drive there. So it's just a really awesome example of prioritizing, walking and cycling over just everywhere needs to be accessible for motor vehicles. The overarching map for this township looks something like this. So we know we've got the car-oriented street, which is the ring road, but everywhere else is basically, let's try and get as much pedestrian and cyclist activity as possible. So they did nominate, we've got this one ring road that also cuts through the middle of the town as well. But anything other than that, let's try and focus on pedestrians and cyclists. So I'll show you how this actually works on ground. So just as an example, this is just the bicycle map that we can see here. So they've got different corridors and they're all color coded and labeled. So it's very clear how cycling connections are maintained to key destinations. So excellent wayfinding. But you also see they provide these are what those permeable barriers meant, things like bollards, things like actual physical obstructions. So vehicles would not be permitted to travel through these little shortcuts, but pedestrians and cyclists have no problem. So the idea of putting these bollards are actually very, very commonly implemented throughout Houghton. And bollards do at times present a risk for cyclists, but I suppose that's a topic for another time. But that is basically how these districts have been managed to be separated. So you can't have that inter-travel in between the districts. Another really important feature that when the shared paths or bicycle tracks do pass carriageways, cyclists actually have the priority. So in this example, you can see the vehicle is yielding to the bike path. And it's also a raised feature as well, a little bit difficult to see there, but that is raised up. So cyclists have one clear path level the whole way through. They're given the priority and motorists have to yield to them. So once again, just flipping that idea that this is always going to be a motor vehicle prioritized space. It's pedestrians and cyclists that get right of way. What we mentioned before about the railway crossing, only 2 opportunities there for motorists to cross it, but there's lots of these underpasses for cyclists to connect underneath. So it just makes it very convenient to get from different districts. They've also done the same philosophy. This is at the ring road. So rather than having to interact with general traffic at the ring road, they provide the underpasses as well. So that grade separation. And this example is actually a little speed hump that's been installed on the bike path because they have, they actually allow e-scooters and e-bikes and motorized scooters on the bike paths. And my Dutch isn't too good, but I believe that says, you know, slow down if you're on a motorized bicycle or anything like that, because there's these humps in there to slow down operating speed. So similar to how we would install local area traffic management treatments on our road network, Houghton's doing it on their bicycle network. There's about 129 kilometres of cycle tracks within Houghton, so it's a significant amount of the area that's been set aside for this. Here's another example of those speed humps. This one's actually been installed to make the intersection kind of stand out a little bit more. Got a grade separated roundabout here. So once again, just an example of not having to bring cyclists and forcing them to interact with general traffic, just keeping them away from the carriageway and just creating their own network, which is not relying on constantly interacting with heavy vehicles or, you know, much larger motor vehicles. Also wanted to just mention that within their local street network, there may not necessarily be those off-road bike, you know, separated paths or anything like that. So what they've done is they've just created these really low speed environments. Generally, the speed limit throughout all the residential streets in Houghton are 30 kilometres per hour. So as soon as you enter the precinct, it's 30 kilometres per hour. And there's all these reminders that vehicles need to give way to cyclists in here. So providing these kind of odd little curves and curb outstands and things like that really slows down vehicles and gives cyclists more confidence riding on road when they have to in these situations. My final slide, Elsa, is just to discuss basically how Houghton residents are using their mode choice within the area. Interestingly, when they do grocery shopping, and I assume that's taking lots and lots of bags, bicycles aren't faring too well because, if you can imagine, a bit difficult, even if you've got cargo bikes and things like that, if you're doing a large shop. The car and public transport is coming out fairly high. But in terms of other very, very common means of travel, so just common day trips, service-related errands, and that includes getting to work and things like that, visiting family and friends. You can see bicycle is definitely taking the lion's share of mode choice. Also should have mentioned that, children getting to school as well, it's certainly seen as the primary means of getting around. And the last little fact I'll include, the number of cyclist fatalities that have been caused by cars within Hewdens since the 1970s is 0. So it's a pretty forward-thinking little town, and it's doing wonderful things in terms of road safety and wonderful things in terms of active transport. Ilsa, over to you.
Thanks, Max. I guess I'll just ask one question that is relevant. Do you know what they have in terms of their motorbikes? Are those allowed in those spaces, or is that included in those vehicle spaces?
Motorbikes would be on carriageway, yes. So they would not be allowed to operate within the separated bike path network. It's only motorized scooters are for some reason, but yeah, not motorized, not motorbikes.
All right. Thank you very much, Max. And now I will introduce Nicole. And if you want to just start putting your slides up. So Nicole is a transport planner and policy advisor. She currently works as an associate director in transport planning for engineering consultants AECOM in Sydney, managing infrastructure design and policy. In this role, she currently leads on inclusive design, including AECOM's research on women's safety when traveling. She worked on cycling projects in Sydney and Canberra and has reviewed active travel work across Australia and New Zealand. Prior to her current role, Nicole was Mobility Program Director at urban policy think tank Committee for Sydney, and before moving to Australia, was an academic researcher and visiting lecturer based in London, with recent affiliations to University College London, University of Westminster, and University of Cambridge. Nicole is a recognized thought leader and expert on transport and was recently awarded Fellowship of the Chartered Institution of Highway and Transportation. Most recently, Nicole advised to UK government's Social Mobility Commission on the role of transport policy on upward mobility and connecting to opportunities and education. Nicole was a regularly invited expert on transport policy to government committees, including to the London Assembly Transport, as well as Budget and Performance Committee and the House of Commons Transport Committee. So that is Nicole. Thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you all. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I am on. I'm currently talking to you from Sydney, which is the Gadigal country of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name's Nicole Badstuber. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I will be talking to you a bit about creating safe and accessible cycling spaces. There are two lenses which I would like to talk you through today, and I think they will be really helpful in highlighting some of the shortcomings of the transport systems that we rely on. Most cities, the city I am in today in Sydney, as well as my hometown city of London, rely on legacy transport systems which were designed by and for able-bodied men, and often don't address the transport needs and travel needs of the whole population sufficiently. So in this presentation today, I'm just going to fly you through these two lenses. Either of them should be given their due, presentations themselves, or a whole week that we could talk about this topic. But I'd really like to just prompt you to think about some of the transport projects that you yourself work on and how we might better design both the transport systems and the urban spaces around them to meet the needs of all. Transport is a derived demand, so most of us are traveling to get places, to meet friends, loved ones, have that access to opportunities and services, and when that transport system isn't designed for all of those trips in mind, just those commuting trips as it traditionally has been, it's not serving its function sufficiently. So the two lenses I would love to talk to you through today are gender and the gendered experience of travel, and then disability and chronic health. So let's start with gender. So as many of you will know, or have personal experience of traveling spaces as a woman or non-binary person, are often not the same experiences as those that our male counterparts have. Here are some statistics for Australia, but there are some statistics from some of the global cities, such as Paris, where 100% of women have reported experiencing sexual harassment on public transport, or the latest data out of the UK, where 82% of women don't feel safe walking through their own local neighbourhood at night. The statistics that we have here in Australia suggest that 1 in 5 women don't feel safe walking home alone at night. 70% of women don't feel safe in public spaces at night, and 20% do not walk home because of feeling unsafe. So it's both affecting the experience of travel and leading to people opting out of that travel, which then in turn means that they're missing out on those opportunities to talk to loved ones, spend time with them, but also jobs and education and access to places such as the doctor's surgery. When people are feeling unsafe, this leads to travel behavior change. So one of them is taking a longer route. A personal example of that might be, I walk to work, and on my way to work, I walk through Hyde Park in Sydney. After dark, I often choose not to do that because there's no one around, and even when there is lighting, it's only on the footpaths. Many of you might have had a similar experience, or something that I think really highlights how this issue isn't well addressed is your navigation apps. If you put into your Google Maps or Apple Maps sending you to somewhere new, pretty much every occasion it will send me through a green space at dark, after dark. And so therefore is highlighting how we aren't currently designing that with those safety concerns in mind. Another way that people change their behavior in response to feeling unsafe is traveling with someone and leaving early. So whether that's leaving before it gets dark or leaving earlier when there's more people around on the streets, so that you feel safe with the presence of others. And ultimately, as we showed in the previous slide, a chunk of people do opt out of traveling at all and stay home because of that perception and experience of the lack of safety. So here is a screenshot of some work that we have been doing at ACOM. I've been working with a wonderful group of passionate transport planners and urban designers to create this research pilot that we have. So you can scan this QR code and it will take you to the website, and broadly what you will see is a map. You can geolocate, or you can in the top put in your address, whether that's where you currently are, or your home address, or somewhere you often visit, and you can give us a rating of what that space feels like to you. It's on a scale of 1 to 7, with 7 being very unsafe and 1 being very safe. And as you can see on the screenshot on the right, there's green, pink, orange pins in the locations around Sydney CBD, and then those groupings, which the numbers indicate with the bubbles. I would love for you to contribute to this, whether that's somewhere you feel really safe. It might be your home street, or somewhere where you've gone through that hasn't felt safe, such as a dark underpass or a dark corner, or somewhere outside a public transport hub which doesn't feel safe to you. This is really important that we capture your personal experience of that, and there is varying perceptions of what feels safe and what doesn't. So here are some examples of the submissions that we had. So you can submit photos as well as descriptions through the pilot. And the commonalities in these images, I hope you can pick up yourselves as well, is that it's empty, there's really no one around, it's dark, often those spaces are not well maintained, and they feel like spaces you could easily be entrapped. So someone can just cut you off at either end, whether that's a tunnel or underpass or a travelator, as in the top left image. To starkly contrast that empty, dark feeling are some of the submissions that were put in for safe spaces. So yes, some of these are during the day, but they are well-maintained spaces where there are barriers, such as the bottom left image. They are ones that are permeable, you can see through, such as the gate. They are often designated spaces for pedestrians or active travel users. They are light, they are well-maintained. It looks like there's people around that care. So to give you maybe a few takeaways that you can take away from this presentation today, here are 4 key themes of what we can do to create spaces that feel safer. Number 1 is lighting, and initially you might think the brighter the better. Good lighting is really important and really does help with the perception and experience of safety. However, just the brighter the better is not necessarily true. And what is really important is having even lighting. So as we transition between spaces, take the example of a well-lit public transport stop, and then the surrounding adjacent area potentially falls in the jurisdiction of a different authority and therefore isn't as well lit. What we really want to avoid is those dark corners, what we can't see, and that picks up well on the next 2, which is passive surveillance and sightlines. So sightlines really is your ability to see through the space and across the space to be able to anticipate whether or not some danger might be coming to you, or that this is a space you can feel safe in. Passive surveillance is a term that we use really for what is essentially eyes on the street. That might be people being able to see you from adjacent street fronts, so shops or restaurants or apartment blocks, but also just on the street themselves, and there being a perception of safety through that presence. There's someone around that you could call if you needed help. And the 4th category is urban design, and that picks up on what I mentioned alongside those photographs. So spaces that feel well maintained, well designed, looked after, cared for, like there is an investment in this space, and therefore the opposite of those dark, abandoned, empty spaces that were submitted as unsafe. So moving on to the second lens, and I know we're rushing through this really fast, but really these are just prompts to give you, a prompt to think about these issues with a different lens in mind. So disability and chronic health problems are something that's really quite commonplace. You might live in a household with someone who has one of these. 1 in 3 in Australia lives with disability or a chronic health condition. And the inclusive term that the best practice guidance suggests is the term with disability rather than a, because really can have more than one. So 8 million people in Australia live with this every day, and it impacts how they navigate the spaces, how they live their lives. 3/4 of those with disability, so 3 in 4, have a mobility impairment. So for us as transport planners, engineers, this is really important to bear in mind. Half of the people with disability need help, need active help with their mobility. They might need a mobility aid, that might be a wheelchair, but not necessarily a walking stick, as I myself sometimes need. This is really important when we think of spaces, and often where our personal experiences might cloud what we think is necessary to navigate these spaces. So the UK Department for Transport came up with some good practice guidance at the beginning of this year on inclusive mobility. And one thing which I think is really useful to frame this conversation is what we define as a disability. And there are 5 broad categories here. So mobility impairment, which is what we touched on, 70% of people with disability have some sort of mobility impairment. About 10% of them will need a wheelchair, but not everyone. And that is often that we think to as a default when we think of people designing for people with disability. There are people with a vision impairment, that is around 600,000 in Australia. A hearing impairment, that's 1 in 6 Australians have a hearing impairment. And then the next 2 categories, which are often not considered, but I think are really useful to help us design spaces that are more inclusive. So that's limitations on mobility in from the point of view of limited reaching, stretching, dexterity. So that might be someone who lives with muscular dystrophy or arthritis. And then finally, neurological and learning differences. So that might be people who are on the autism spectrum, or simply considering how we communicate things such as wayfinding or ticket machines in a way that is as simple as possible and therefore is accessible for everyone. Really importantly, these are not mutually exclusive. So people often have more than one disability, or benefit from design spaces that have more than one of these in mind. So how does that relate back to cycling? Well, actually, this is really important when we think about cycling. Traveling by cycle is a useful mobility aid for many with disability. 12% of people with disability regularly cycle, which compares to around 17%. So that's 1 in 8. And 3 out of 4, so 75% of cyclists with disability find this easier than having to walk. It helps them get around, and as you can see from some of the icons I made there are a whole range of different cycles, and cycles again is really the term to use rather than bicycle, so that we're more inclusive of the breadth of vehicles that are used. So here are some of the design principles actually from the Transport for New South Wales cycle toolbox, which I think are relevant to highlight when we are considering designing for people with disability or chronic health conditions. So yes, that's the number of lanes, speed of the traffic, the volume of the traffic, and then importantly, the presence of cycle infrastructure. There, me not using my own terminology, but and the separation of it and the width of it. And this is really important when we think about designing those spaces, because the standard bicycle needs less space than some of these cycles that enable a broader range of people to partake in cycling. So I've just pulled out a few here. If you look at that toolbox, you'll be able to find a few more figures and numbers for the different variety of cycles, or also that document I referred you to from the UK. So Highways England recommends that the amount of space we should be allocating as a default for a cycle of any design is 2.8 meters in length and 1.2 meters in width. And as you can see at the top right there, that really is significantly more than the 1.8 that a standard bicycle would be. And then below you can see sort of a wheelchair friendly tricycle needing more space and a cargo cycle also needing more space. And to leave you, here is my last slide. What I've sought to do is highlight how some of the design features that are often put in place around cycling infrastructure are barriers to those who use some of those adapted cycles or those more inclusive vehicle dimensions. So those continuous curbs in the top left-hand corner, actually an example from where I used to live near in London, you can see that the width of that cycle infrastructure does not accommodate some of those cycles we saw in the last slide, whilst having those wider cycle infrastructure paths and lanes does allow more people to partake. Bollards are often set very closely. If we set them at least at 1.5 meters apart, they allow people with that range of cycles to use as well. When we have sudden closures, I mean, also an example here of how active travelers are often thought of last, where we are putting temporary street furniture in the way of cycle infrastructure. Let's not do that. And then finally, something you might see quite a lot often outside of urban environments are those barriers, which really do make it really difficult for people in a differently sized dimension cycle to navigate and use those spaces. So instead, let's put in tactile paving or other prompts to help keep those spaces inclusive. So that is all from me. If anyone would like to talk about these topics more, do reach out. You can find me on LinkedIn or via my ACOM email. Here's just that QR code again if you have a moment to take part in that research exercise. But thank you very much for listening and coming along to the talk today.
Thank you, Nicole. And thank you, Max, for those two presentations. Really hits home. I mean, I sometimes find myself riding my bike at night because I rather ride home at night than walk home at night. And so that's how I'm using that cycle infrastructure late at night as someone that is female. So yeah, these topics are really great conversation starters for this issue. So we will kick off our Q&A session now. And yeah, just a reminder for everybody to please submit your Q&As or your questions through the Q&A function. So we'll kick it off. Yeah, so someone did just note the lack of bike helmets in your presentation, Max. But we did note that it is not a legal requirement there. So interesting, yeah, that they were not wearing them.
Yeah, same in the UK as well. It's not legal requirement to ride with a bicycle, but
yeah,
one of those debates that kind of comes around every now and then. If you're forcing people to wear helmets, are you then putting a restriction on the availability of active transport? But yeah, I think there's so much solid evidence out there to show that helmets are generally reducing the level of trauma when there are collisions. So yeah,
yes,
I understand kind of both arguments there.
Yeah. Just a general question, if you know this, you might not know the answer to this, just around how much the Netherlands tends to invest in these types of infrastructure compared to Australia and New Zealand. It might be too niche of a question.
Yeah, it's quite specific. In terms of in terms of like a town like Hewden, because they've got all these shared paths and, you know, lots of cycling infrastructure, the need to, you know, have to resheet or rectify pavement issues wouldn't be as a significant concern because they're not getting the same levels of, you know,
heavy
vehicles traveling over on their network, so they probably get savings there. But in terms of that ratio, how it looks to Australia and New Zealand, I couldn't give you an exact figure, but a kind of another interesting point that comes up in this space also, like in terms of cycling attractiveness, people always complain about Melbourne weather or Tassie's weather or even Northern Territory. You know, it's just not a place to cycle. Well, Canberra and Northern Territory, they're actually the leaders in Australia for getting on bicycles in terms of as a ratio to their population. And if you look at Amsterdam or the Netherlands, it's freezing there. It actually freezes there, like canals freeze over and things like that, and it doesn't disturb those. So yeah, just another point I wanted to add in there, Ilse. A bit off topic, but anyway.
That's okay. Thanks, Max. Yeah, a question for Nicole. So, hi, Nicole. People who identify as female tend to do more of the care work in the community, be that children or elderly parents, and therefore trip chain, drop off kids off at school, daycare, work, etc. Go to the doctors, do the groceries. How do we incorporate the different travel needs of women in our transport systems?
Yeah, I could talk about that all day long. Yeah, so that's a really important one, and I think highlights how our systems aren't set up for that at all. I think with respect to cycling is actually something that could much better accommodate trip chaining and those more local trips between neighborhoods, which are often poorly catered for by the rail and legacy bus systems that we have. So I think investing in cycling supports addressing those gender biases that we have in our transport systems. Of course, we should also be doing more. Some of the investments that do specifically address that come to mind for me immediately, and this is of course also my bias of being from London, is something called the London Overground, where they actually took disused railway, chunks of railway that were going through the inner London area, and created a new orbital route. So often what we have is that generally the way cities are set up is you have the CBD and you have a transport system set up to get people, historically the breadwinners, from those suburbs into the CBD and back again, and really optimized for that commute. So what women often do, and why they trip chain, is that doesn't accommodate that very well. It doesn't go to where you need to drop off your kid in the supermarket on the way home. So cycling can help with those local trips, but we should probably also be using more flexible public transport vehicles such as buses to better meet those travel demands.
Thank you. Great. Question for Max. What are your thoughts regarding current road design standards in Australia? As much as I'd love to design roads like those presented, we are simply not allowed as they won't meet the necessary standards. So what are your thoughts on how to work with the standards that we have?
That's a very valid point. Certainly they have been set up to prioritise, general traffic movements and getting passenger vehicles, heavy vehicles, those type of modes. They're at the top of the shelf, basically. But I think this, what we're seeing at the moment is this shift towards the movement in place framework, which I touched on briefly. It's kind of been around for 5 years or so in Australia, and other jurisdictions have had it a little bit longer. But I think this idea of really recognising that it's not all just about movement of, efficient movement of goods and people, but it's also about the fact that people like to enjoy these spaces. They like to, stop and dwell and meet friends and, just sit down and have a good time there. So if we start thinking more in those strategic type of lens, and even if we look at our local streets, well, why do they need to be an urban default of 50 kilometers per hour when they're not meant to be, something that has a high speed or a high movement kind of criteria? That's not the purpose of those networks. So if we can use that as almost our foundation or our benchmark, and then create a story from that to then try and get improved cyclist connectivities within our local communities and various areas. But I'll also just add there, sorry, I keep thinking of other things as I'm going, but I would say any road network in our jurisdictions, you could pick anyone, and there would be departures from standards. There would be departures from a particular guidance or an Australian standards or something like that. So people get a little bit nervous when perhaps we're not meeting the exact, carriageway widths or traffic lane widths, or this doesn't meet the metrics to put a wombat crossing there, for instance. Yeah. We need to acknowledge that sometimes there may be a departure, but perhaps our standards just aren't reflecting what this specific environment requires or what this community would benefit from. So I would say standards aren't necessarily an indication of how to apply best practice infrastructure. It's a bit more complex than that.
And I'd argue that COVID has really brought out some innovation. I've seen a few presentations from people in New South Wales and I mean the pop-up bike lanes in Victoria and things like that. I think councils and government is willing to collaborate and look at innovative ideas that might go away from standards. Thank you, Max. Nicole, while designing, we often end up just complying with minimum widths. I guess this is also a standard question. How can we justify the wider widths to cater for cargo bikes and other cycles?
Well, hopefully we're laying some of the groundwork for that by raising awareness of why those standards and those minimums are insufficient. I think, so I, for example, work on a project at the moment, and we are having that debate about how we use that space between the curbs and whether we allocate it to parking, whether we allocate it to widening the cycle paths. I think what is helpful is when the guidance does indicate what the desired widths are as well as what the minimums are. And I've been working on projects in Canberra, and in that jurisdiction, a lot of the guidance specifies that you have to argue why you aren't going for the desired versus why you are going beyond the minimum, if that makes sense. And so I think that is probably a really helpful framework to start applying, instead of starting from the minimum and then having to argue why you have more than that. I think also as we raise awareness that 1.2 is not sufficient for a lot of these other cycles that aren't just the standard bicycle, and that will hopefully become a bit more omnipresent in our awareness as transport planners and engineers.
Great, thank you. Max, just a quick question if you know the answer. Do you know if there's any research into the effectiveness of speed humps on off-road paths? Any chance?
I haven't actually seen any. I'm sure there would be. Yeah, I haven't seen anything, sorry, within Australian, New Zealand context, but because we don't generally use them all that frequently. A lot of the times it might be a horizontal kind of deflection to slow down cyclists, or even things like chicanes or bollards are used to slow down cyclists. But the vertical deflection, the example that was shown there was obviously in the Netherlands. So there's probably some research that's used in the Crow manual if anyone wants to get a hand of that, and then have a flick through there. But I'm not, at the top of my head, I couldn't tell you.
That's okay. That's okay. Thank you, Max.
That's right.
Nicole, do you know if there's a one-stop document that you would recommend for inclusive design? We have had somebody previously present from ACOM on lighting and effective lighting for safety. And so, yeah, is there a document that you can use to consider this in design or evaluate
So I
future
would,
designs?
yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to
That's okay.
talk over you there.
That's okay. That's okay.
So I would recommend looking up the Department for Transport in the UK's inclusive mobility guidance, which is specifically on designing for disability and active travel. But yes, I think, a challenge of both the work I do every day and sort of this becoming something that is we're all aware of, is that there isn't necessarily just a one document that we can all go to. There are, of course, the standards around DDA compliance and all of that, but I think if you're looking for one document, I would recommend that Department for Transport one. But yeah, also happy to give any more reading recommendations if anyone wants to reach out to me.
Thank you, Nicole. Max, do you know how Houghton manages their pedestrian and cyclist? Is it mostly shared use paths, or is it kind of mostly separated? Do you know?
Yeah, it's largely separated. So bike paths, high speed travel, that's your network. And then adjacent would be a footpath where pedestrians are able. So not the same philosophy that we generally apply, which is shared path networks. Yeah.
Okay.
Good question.
And we're kind of running close to the end, so I'll maybe ask two more questions. Nicole, taking into account different travel needs of parents, especially moms, is worth considering how the lack of safe bicycle routes for kids to schools, supporting parks and neighborhoods burden them driving mom taxis, as well as creating extra car trips. How can transport and education sectors advocate for more effectively for safe cycle routes?
So what I think first up is really useful is to think about designing a cycling infrastructure that is safe for children, whether you take the yardstick of 8 or 12-year-olds to independently use. So that would sort of be the first one, and that does lead to sort of quite a lot of debate. Often what is like what people like to use as an indicator of future demand is who's currently using it. So often currently only road cyclists or people using it for leisure might use it, and they don't necessarily need separate and protected cycle infrastructure. But what we want to do is obviously allow kids early on, mums with cargo bikes, or any parent with cargo bike and anyone in an e-bike or any of those adapted bicycles to use the space. So if we start with those users in mind, then we can design spaces that are inclusive and serve everyone well. And I guess that's how I sort of hoped that might be a takeaway from today, is that applying these lenses isn't we just want to create spaces which are good for these particular groups, but by considering those groups' design requirements specifically, we create spaces that help address those biases that we currently have in the system and create spaces that are good for everyone. So what local government could do is slow down street speed. That's the easiest thing that you could do to help make it a more cycle-friendly environment, and then obviously put in some of those physical design features to help reduce speed, because just the speed sign posting alone won't necessarily reduce speeds. I think travel to school plans could more actively look at how we design local cycle networks to those primary schools in particular, because they will be within a catchment-based precinct. So yeah, there's lots we can do. Something that is done in London is actually banning drop-off around schools, around 100 meter around the school, and putting in safe schools speed limits around the school when it's pick up and drop off time for kids. So that helps encourage active travel to those primary schools. Hopefully some of that was something you can take away.
Yes, that was great. I think we'll actually wrap up with that. That was really good end of the discussion. So thank you very much. And thank you both for taking the time to present to us today. And if anybody has further questions, I guess they can direct it to you guys directly.
Absolutely.
So yeah, thank you very much. And then just some final announcements. Our next webinar will be Sustainable Road Pavements, and it is going to be on October the 26th at 5 p.m. And that is all from us today. Thank you very much, everybody. And again, this recording will be available for everybody in the next few days. So have a lovely Thursday? Oh my gosh, it's Thursday. Have a lovely Thursday, everybody. And we'll see you guys soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ilsa.
Thanks.